Good morning, family. So happy to be here with you today. I ran a little bit late trying to work out some lighting. As you can see, it's a little bit dark in here, but I didn't want to be too late. So hopefully you all will be able to put up with the darkness a little bit. We will go on forward because we are not in darkness. As Christians, we are in light. I actually have some light here too, but it's not doing everything that I'd like for it to do. Good morning, Sandy. Again, welcome. Glad you could be here with us. And again, if you are not tuning in live at 10 o'clock every Monday through Friday, and you have an opportunity to peek in on us a little bit later, then we certainly welcome you as well, encourage you, and thank you for being here. And certainly would encourage you to invite others who may have need for just a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of Bible, a little bit of love. Good morning, Georgia, and just a little bit of fellowship. In these times, we certainly could use all that we can get in that arena. This morning, I'd like for you, if you would, to prepare yourselves for a discussion that's going to take place in Job. We're going to be using the book of Job this morning as our launching pad for our discussion. And I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion because there's so much there in the book of Job, especially as it relates to dealing with just amongst the most difficult times that occur in our lives, anything that we can imagine, just as tough as they can potentially be. And it's certainly worth considering that because times like that we're going through right now are times like we've not experienced before, that no one alive has experienced before. Unprecedented is some of the words that you hear people saying. The last time something like this happened, I've heard a World War II veteran talk about it in that way. But that didn't affect people the way that it is now. I mean, on an everybody basis. And of course, there was the Spanish flu back, I think, in 1918. And that was similar. But of course, the infrastructure and the communication and the way that the world is tied together today did not exist in those days. And so here again, we find a lot of people going through a lot of things. So it's very much different than what we might have ordinarily expected. Brandon, glad to have you here. Terry, Tom, Julius, always glad to see you as well. Welcome everybody who is coming in and signing in. We're asking you to meet us at Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1. And again, I apologize for the lighting here. I ended up in a place in the house that doesn't have very much light, so it's a little bit darker in here. But we're gonna push on and make adjustments tomorrow. Let's go ahead and get started because there's quite a bit that is here. And we all know the story of Job, and this morning we'll take a look at some of the details and circumstances. Now, while it certainly can be approached from a number of theological perspectives, the goal today is really to talk about what Job did in the face of the things that happened to him. And it's hoped that this will give us an example. This will give us a template. This will inspire us to undergo these days or any kind of quote unquote worst days to come with strength, with grace, with faith, and certainly with reverence for God. And so if I had to kind of come up with a theme for the message today, really the thing that jumps out to me is perspective. Perspective, perhaps with a subtitle of how to handle the worst days of your life. How to handle the worst days of your life. So when we take a look at the book of Job, I think that what we can find is that ultimately the main theme and the purpose of this book is to reveal that the value of God is supreme over all things, And we would also see that God is just. But the purpose of this book reveals that our limited view of the world makes God's justice sometimes incomprehensible, sometimes difficult to quite understand. We don't understand why we go through some of the things that we go through. We don't understand how God works and why he does some of the things that he does. And we don't even understand which things can be attributed to God and perhaps which things should not be attributed to God. And this is not to say that God is limited in any way. I'm not suggesting that at all. But those are some of the questions that we have during times like these. And so what Job shows us, the book and the individual, is that God is not to be cursed, but rather to be feared, to be worshiped, and to be reverenced, even in the midst of suffering. So let's get into this. And I've kind of broken this up into three little areas. And I want to start with the first 5 verses of chapter 1 of the book of Job. And so if you've got that, then certainly I would encourage you and urge you to follow along. Here the Bible says that there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters that were born to him. And his possessions were also 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camel, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. Verse 4 says that his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day. And they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. Now, there's a couple of things that I think is worthy of discussing with regard to this. First of all, when we see that God did continually, I take it is that was Job's status quo. And we can talk about his possessions, we can talk about his riches, we can talk about his servants and all these things, and we can even compare them to things that people may have today. How many cars you have, and how many homes you have, and what your income is, and your stock portfolio, and so on and so forth. But clearly he was a very well-to-do person. Clearly he was a family person. He was a father, and he loved his children, and his children were successful, and they all had strong relationships with one another. And it was part of Job's habit and responsibility to consecrate his children and to issue this burnt offering for them. Why? Against any sin that they may have committed, which also tells us that there was a relationship there with God, right? So his life, before anything happened, even just as an introduction, this is what his life consists of. And that was his status quo. And so I would encourage each one of us to consider, what is our status quo? What's the condition of our socioeconomic status? What's the condition of our employment or investments? How we spend our time, where we go, what we do, who we know, what's our relationship with our family? And just consider that a status quo. Just consider that a starting point for everywhere that we're going to go with the story this morning. I would also encourage you to take a look at Job's habits. Again, how he raised his family, and most importantly, his relationship with God. Because again, if he's consecrating the kids and he's making these sacrifices on their behalf, just sort of looking out for them in his relationship with God, that says something about him. And one of the things that I notice is that what he's doing here already involves God. You know, a lot of times with very, very, very wealthy people, they feel like they don't need God. That poor people need God because they don't have anything else. But wow, once I've accomplished this and once I've accumulated that, what do I need God for? I have everything I need. Now, I'm not saying that that's true of every rich person, but you know, we can go to the Bible and talk about the rich young ruler who was unwilling to release and relinquish his riches for heaven that he also desired. We can talk about the man who had all these wonderful possessions and tore down barns in order to build bigger ones so that he can take his life at ease. And so money, the love thereof, can be, or is, as the Bible calls it, the root of all evil. So there are certain pitfalls with riches, but notice that even with everything that Job had, he had a relationship with God. And what I submit to you, family, is that his relationship with God and his habits as it relates to him doing his sacrifices on a regular basis are the foundation. That is to say, the firewall. That is to say, the house that is built on a firm foundation against troubled times. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, well, think about it this way. It is tougher to build a house in a storm than it is to go into one for shelter that is already built. And what I'm suggesting to you is that there was a foundation in a house built on a firm foundation that Job already had with God ahead of the tough times that were going to come. Welcome, Brenda. We are studying in Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1, we find ourselves in the first 6 verses, but we're going to move here pretty quickly. So that's where things began with Job. That's our introduction to him. Now, again, because we're focusing on a particular aspect of the story, I'm not going to get into the whole thing about the sons of God gathering in heaven and Satan and what are you doing walking to and forth. That's not what we're doing today. We're just looking at what happens to Job and how he handles it. So now we find ourselves in verses 13 through 22 of the first book. And here, and I don't know if I'm going to read all of this, but what we can see here is that there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking in the oldest brother's house. Again, they did this really every day. 7 brothers, 7 days, they would invite the sisters. And this was a typical day where they were having dinner at one of the brothers' house. And so a messenger came to Job and said that the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. And they also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And so now we start to see that Job is getting some bad news. A lot of his livestock have been taken by enemies. And then no sooner than he got that information, then another servant showed up and said that there was a fire that fell from heaven, and it burned up all the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And only this person lived to tell the story. And even while that person was speaking, another one said that the Chaldeans came and they made raids on the camels and took them and slew even more servants. And while he was talking, another one came and said, your sons and daughters were having dinner at the oldest son's house, and the house fell in on them and killed every single one of your kids. I mean, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so in verse 20 of this, the Bible says that Job arose and tore his robe. Now I'm going to stop there because I'm going to come back to that. But what I'd like to point out to you is notice the tragedy. You lose everything of value and you lose everything of worth. You lose everything that you love. Camels and oxen and sheep notwithstanding, how could anyone stand the death of their children? And brothers and sisters, I'm a living witness of what it's like to lose a child. And for Job to have lost 7 sons and 3 daughters in one tragic accident quickly adds even more perspective to the overall loss. It's one thing to lose property. It's one thing to lose possessions, but to lose life. And all these things happen to him at the same time. Now, here's something that we should do. We should really be thinking, how would I respond? How would I react in a situation like that? What is it that I, fill in your name, would do? Or how would I feel if anything remotely similar like to that happened to me? Now, I'm sure that we all have our own answers. I would have mine. I'm sure you have yours. But the purpose of us having this conversation is to take a look at what Job did in an effort to help inform and influence what we might do if something similar happened to us. The first thing I would point out to you is that he grieved when the Bible in verse 20 says that Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head. In that culture at that time, those were the things that you did where you were in grief. And I mean just abject grief. Shaving of the head was a sacrifice. It was something that was designed to indicate the deepest of sorrows, and tearing your clothes again is something that is designed to express emotion. Now, we may not necessarily do that in our culture, but grief when you see it. People screaming. People falling on the ground. People crying. Some people just run. There's just some people faint. I mean, there are any number of things that people do to express their grief. And so this is what he did. So clearly he was grieving. And so as Christians, we wouldn't ever say that there's anything wrong with grieving. It is a human response to those things that just rock us emotionally. And I tell you, when you talk about being rocked, I mean, it doesn't get much worse than what Job had to endure. So he's doing what any of us would do, and he is grieving. But notice also this. The Bible in verse 20 also says that he fell to the ground and worshiped. Now some of us might be saying, well, that's a bit counterintuitive because, it may not be the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, 20th, 80th thing that I'm thinking about in view of these things to worship. To worship. To me, that says something about his relationship with God first, but it also says something about him. How do you worship in the worst trial, the worst tribulation imaginable? I don't know. I don't. I can see the value in it. I can see the purpose of it. But is that what we do? And I can't speak for everybody. But I would imagine that most of us don't. We may get there, but it may not be the first thing that we do. Now watch verse 21. Here it says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, what that says to me, family, is that Job had an extraordinary perspective. We get so caught up in our possessions. We get so caught up in our reputation. We get so very caught up in things that those things define us. And to suffer the loss of those things, again, the kids notwithstanding, diminishes us in our own eyes. And we feel that the world is over, that life is over if we don't have those things. But Job didn't feel that way. He says, listen, when I was born, when God gave me life, I didn't have a thing. And everything that I ultimately did have came from God. It was his to give. And now it's gone. It was his to take away. And he says, blessed be the name of the Lord. In other words, I just thank God that I was given life and I was given the opportunity to have these things. I acknowledge and recognize that I don't have them anymore, but they were never mine because God gave them to me in the first place. And if he takes them, then they're his to take. And I'm just thankful that he thought enough of me to allow me to have what I had when I had it. That's perspective. That's definitely perspective. And I think that that's something that we should all do what we can to embrace when we find ourselves in these challenging situations and these challenging times. Verse 22 finally says that through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. The lessons here are almost too big and too heavy to handle. Because here again, if it were any of us, would we have blamed God? I know people who blame God when far less happens to them. There was a very good friend of mine at one time who lost her grandmother, who she loved very, very, very dearly. Of course, we all love our grandmas. And we had a long conversation, a long tearful conversation, a long angry conversation. She was mad at God. She was mad at God. And just felt like if God was God, then he could have done something about this. And this is not unusual. I know a lot of people that get mad at God because they're hurting. I always take heart the fact that, you know what, if you're mad at God, that means you believe in God. It also means that you're expressing normal human emotions. And I get that. That's fine as well. God's got some massive shoulders. God can handle you being mad at him. It's fine. You know, don't blaspheme. Don't depart from God. Don't decide that God doesn't exist. But if you and your normal human emotions get mad with God, God can handle that. And hopefully you will come through that and you will come out of it. And I've known people who've done that as well. It's a good thing not to get mad at God and to do what Job has done. But if it happens, okay. But he did not sin. And a lot of people will go right off the deep end when stuff happens to them as well. They will jump into the deep end of the pool of sin and just backstroke it. I would encourage you not to do that at any time. And certainly not during the worst of your times. It'd be great if we could stop the story there and say, this is how he handled the things that happened to him. But believe it or not, it got worse. In chapter 2, beginning in verse 7, again, passing up all the stuff about the conversations between Satan and God, Satan did in fact go out from the presence of God. And the Bible says, smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And so what did Job do in verse 8? He took potsherd, that is to say, broken pieces of pottery, to scrape himself while he was sitting in the ashes. You may say, well, ashes, what do ashes have to do with anything? Again, that was part of the grieving. You may have read in other parts of the Bible where those who were grieving, I mean, David did this when his kid died, clothed themselves in sackcloth, which was a very sort of rough material, the material of grieving, and put ashes all over themselves. You know, this is just another cultural sign of grieving at that time. So here he is sitting in all these ashes, just grieving, and now his health is afflicted. Now he's in physical pain to go along with his emotional pain. He's scraping himself with these broken pieces of pottery, sitting in ashes. And what should happen? His wife comes along in verse 9 and says, do you still hold to your integrity? Are you still a Christian? Are you still a moral agent? What you ought to do is curse God and die. Now, I'm not going to get myself in any trouble at all talking about wives in general or this particular type of wife. Ma'am? Is there something that you'd like to add to the conversation?
No.
Okay, all right. Wife. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speak. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? And then he goes on to say, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. What can we learn from this? First of all, with his health afflicted, he has a response. And I want you to know, family, that this can happen to us. Sometimes when we have tragedies, whatever they may be, whether they're relationship involved, whether they're job involved, whatever it is that they may involve as far as what we would consider tragedies, we can become so consumed by those things that we begin to suffer in our health. Now, I'm not discounting the fact that Satan had a role here, and I'm not discounting the fact that Satan could have a role in anything that may happen to your health if your life begins to kind of circle the drain a bit. But what I'm saying is that just even psychologically and physiologically, our health and our bodies could ultimately begin to break down as a response to some of the tragedies that we're experiencing. And we have to be thoughtful about that. We have to be careful about that. To the very best of our ability, even when we're going through the worst of times, we need to do all we can to protect our health in order for us to be able to continue to move and to do things that need to be done. But I don't want to go too far into that, but just understand that his now he's dealing with his health, which is incredible. Then he deals with this situation with his wife. And I just want to kind of put this in a larger and more general sense that there are those who will come alongside you, and rather than being a comforting and encouraging and helping presence, will be the type that just pours gas on everything. The type that will say, how's that Christianity working for you now? How's that God that you serve working for you now? How's that Jesus that you're always calling upon working for you now? And they will put that in your face. Perhaps that directly, perhaps indirectly, perhaps passively, aggressively so. But there are those who have been perhaps skeptical of your faith that will then show up and then begin to sort of confront you with your faith. And so this is what the wife did in this situation. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Again, are you still this Christian? Do you still say that there's a God? Do you still say that Jesus is the center of your existence? What you need to do is curse them and then die. So it's one thing to curse God, right? Why do that? But then die. Why would a wife tell her husband that you should just die? I mean, have things become so dire that all of a sudden your life isn't worth living anymore? How faithless is that? But then perhaps we wouldn't expect anything different from someone who is not a believer, someone who doesn't have God in their lives, someone who is truly lost. And perhaps they would be messengers of Satan who are just trying to nail the last nail into the coffin, who are trying to take you out. We have to be mindful and thoughtful about those kinds of things too. It's these kinds of things that can happen that should make us draw even closer to God for his protection, for his comfort, for his peace. It's interesting. He says it's foolishness to even think that way. And when he says, shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? Here again, that amazing, amazing perspective. That Job, he has a level of maturity that is rare for him to have had so many things and to have lost them all at the same time, and to have enough presence of mind to recognize that they never belonged to him, but they were gifts of God with which he was entrusted, and that God has the ability to take them back. That's amazing in and of itself. But for him to be able to tell someone who is working against him now, to be able to say to that person, how is it that we can accept good and not be willing to accept adversity? I knew a person once who struggled in his marriage. And it just seemed that there were a number of things that this person had to deal with that was out of his control and out of his wife's control. And at the time, he began to sort of think, well, why me? I didn't sign up for this. I expected my marriage and my relationship and my wife to be A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And, things got a little tough. But perspective is something that he found. Looking at a video of the wedding, of them standing there in front of the priest, in the church, in front of God and everybody, all the witnesses and family. And when the vows were read, he rewound it and played it again, and rewound it and played it again, and rewound it and played it again. And you know what those vows said? They said, for richer, for poor, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. And so the idea is that you, in fact, did sign up for this. And the thought came to him that, you know what, if the wife had been a wealthy heiress, and all of a sudden you became very, very well-to-do, and you had all these things, you gladly accept that. But you know what? If that's not the case, and it ends up being that the wife may need some things, and you become a caregiver, you signed up for that too. And so this is what Job is saying. We accept the good. We look for the good. We need to be able to accept the not so good as well, because according to what he's saying here, they all came from the same God. And God never promised any of us a rose garden. God never promised any of us a pain-free, trial-free life. He gave us life, and we are to live that life and be grateful for that life while we have that life. And if we've lived that life in a manner in keeping with what he requires, then we will have everlasting life. And there will be no trial and no tribulation in that life. That's where our faith comes in. That's what perspective ought to tell us. And lastly, the Bible says that Job did not sin with his lips. So in all of this, he kept his head. In all of this, he kept perspective. In all of this, he kept his love for his God. In all of this, he kept his integrity, as his wife called it. And even though he grieved, and even though he was emotional, and even though he sat there with a bald head, scraping boils off of his skin, and in ashes, he worshiped, praised, and honored God. Family, I realize how difficult that can be for some of us when we go through tough times. But the Bible gives us an example of how to. The Bible gives us an example of someone who did. And we can either choose to follow that example, or we can choose to go our own way. As Joshua said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now, let me close with this. Now, in these days of COVID-19, there are many of us who are dealing with it in a variety of different ways and going through different things. And this may or may not be the worst of your days. If not, then you've already experienced what you feel is the worst of your days. And you know that God can bring you and will bring you through anything after that. Whatever it is that you went through that was the worst thing that's ever happened to you, and you sit here today, clothed and in your right mind, God brought you through that. And if your relationship with God is strong, then you know that God did bring you through that. And if he can bring you through that, what you consider to be the worst, he can bring you through anything. So this, I'm not going to say it's nothing, but compared to what you've already been through, you know what that is. And if it seems that whatever you're going through today with this COVID-19 is the worst that you've seen, the worst that you've been through, then I would invite you to consider Job and how he handled himself. Use his life as perspective compared to yours. Whatever it is that you're going through, did it involve the loss of everything that you own? Did it involve the loss of everyone that you love? Perspective. And I don't want to diminish whatever it is that you might be going through, because if you're hurting, you're hurting. And that pain is real. And it's not for me to tell you that it isn't, or that you shouldn't feel that way about it because it's not as bad as someone else's. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that we can all use a little bit of perspective as we try to navigate how to go through the things that we're going through. And lastly, I would urge you to consider what James said. In the book of James, chapter 5, verse 10 and 11, James wrote this. He says, as an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And the allusion here is to the fact that most of the prophets were criticized, vilified, some were killed. Right? That's what he's saying. And so in verse 11, he says, we count those blessed who endured. You've heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. What's he mean there? What he's saying is that if you go all the way out to the end of Job, you see that everything that Job had was restored 100-fold. He got he had other kids, and those kids grew up to be this, and he had all this wealth. Everything that he had before was restored, and more so. That's what he means when he said that the Lord is full of compassion, it's merciful. That's the outcome of the Lord's dealing. So did Job go through it? Yes. But was he restored? Absolutely. Did God bring him through it? Yes, he did. And God will bring you through this as well. God will bring me through this as well. And all of us who are suffering, who call upon the name of God, we will be brought through. We must have faith in that. We must have confidence in that. We must believe that, and we must behave as if. I pray that you do. I pray that you will. And if you need any help with that, reach out. Just reach out. We'll talk. Let's get together. Let's chop it up. And let's see if there's ways that we can encourage one another. Let's look in the Word of God and see what else it has to say about our particular situation. Christianity is made for times like these. Not so much for times of plenty. Not so much for times of all being well at home, at work, at church, in the neighborhood. But for when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That's what it's for. That's where it's most effective. Now, let me share this with you. I'm excited about something that came to me today. And it came from something that I read somewhere. And it was talking about God and the coronavirus. And so what I'd like to do is, we do these encouragements every day. But I want to start actually a little series. A series of 3 lessons. And so we're going to start on Wednesday. We'll do it Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, 10 o'clock right here, as usual. But we're going to have a particular subject that we're going to explore. And perhaps you have this question. And I'm going to call this God and the virus. God and the virus. And here's what we're going to do. On the first day, we're going to talk about, is God the cause of the virus? We're going to deal with that. I know. It's kind of scary to kind of jump into that subject, but I'm not scared. We're going to do it. And then the second day, we'll go from the standpoint that God is not the cause. Right? So we'll compare, is God the cause and what are the arguments for that? And is God not the cause and what are the arguments for that? And on the third day, on Friday, we will talk about our response to the virus. Right? How should we be responding to the virus after having studied whether God is the cause or God is not? Whether he is or whether he isn't, how should we be responding to it? So I'm excited about that study. I'm going to be spending the next couple of days kind of preparing it and getting it ready for you. So be sure to show up here, well, really every day, but show up on Wednesday, show up on Thursday, show up on Friday, and let's get into this. This is real. This is what people are talking about. And I think that we as Christians ought to be equipped to be able to understand these things, to be able to use Scripture, to be able to develop a perspective on these things, and to be able to talk coherently and intelligently and scripturally about them. So I'm super excited about this, and I hope that you are too, and that you will join me, and that bring a friend, tell people. Let's get into this thing. All right, family. We've been together for a few minutes here, and I hope, trust, and pray that these conversations are encouraging to you, that they're edifying to you, that they are bringing hope and building faith and giving confidence, and just all the people who show up, that we're building and maintaining a sense of community, a community of God. I wish you peace, I wish you safety, and I wish you blessings. God bless you all, and we'll see you again tomorrow.